The rancher had sealed his land with barbed wire, until 5 native girls waited just beyond the fence. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Montana plains when Samuel Hartwell first noticed them. 5 silhouettes standing motionless beyond his newly installed barbed wire fence, their presence as unsettling as it was inexplicable. He had risen before dawn, as was his custom, to check the perimeter of his 3,000-acre ranch. The wire gleamed silver in the early light, each barb catching dewdrops that would soon evaporate under the strengthening sun. Samuel had spent the better part of 2 months installing that fence, every post driven deep into the unforgiving earth, every wire stretched taut, with the precision of a man who understood that in this territory, boundaries meant survival. The year was 1878, and the Montana Territory was still raw, still dangerous. Cattle rustlers, claim jumpers, and hostile tribes made every rancher's life a constant gamble with death. But these figures were different. They stood perfectly still, like statues carved from the morning mist itself. Samuel squinted, his weathered hand instinctively moving to the Colt 45 at his hip. The distance made details impossible to discern, but something about their stillness unnerved him more than movement would have. He had purchased this land from the territorial government 6 months ago, drawn by the promise of endless grazing and the crystal-clear stream that cut through the northern section. The previous owner, a man named Thompson, had abandoned the property after what the locals called troubles with the natives. Samuel had dismissed such talk as the paranoid ramblings of men who saw threats in every shadow. Now, watching those motionless figures, he wondered if Thompson had been more prescient than foolish. Samuel's ranch house sat on a gentle rise that afforded him a commanding view of the surrounding plains. The structure was modest but solid, built from local timber and stone with his own hands. A wide porch wrapped around the front and east side, providing shade during the brutal summer afternoons and a vantage point for watching his herd. The barn, constructed with equal care, housed his prize stallion and the equipment necessary for running a successful cattle operation. The land itself was everything he had dreamed of during his years as a cavalry officer. Rolling hills covered in rich grassland stretched to the horizon, broken only by stands of cottonwood and willow that marked the path of seasonal streams. The main creek never ran dry, fed by mountain springs that remained cold even in the height of summer. Buffalo had grazed here for centuries, their presence evidenced by the well-worn trails that crisscrossed the property. Samuel had invested everything he owned into this venture: his military pension, his savings, even the gold watch his father had given him before the war. The cattle he had driven up from Texas represented not just livestock, but his entire future. Every head of beef was a calculated risk, every decision a step toward either prosperity or ruin. The barbed wire fence represented the culmination of his planning. He had read about the new invention in agricultural journals, marveling at its potential to transform ranching. No longer would he need to hire riders to constantly patrol his borders. The wire would keep his cattle in and unwanted visitors out. It was progress. Civilization imposed upon the wilderness. But progress, Samuel was learning, often came with unexpected consequences. The 5 figures remained motionless as he saddled his horse, a bay mare named Constance. The animal sensed his unease, prancing nervously as he tightened the cinch. Samuel had learned to trust his horse's instincts during his cavalry days. Animals possessed senses that men had long forgotten, attuned to dangers that civilization had taught humans to ignore. The ride to the fence line took 20 minutes, long enough for Samuel to study the figures more carefully. As he drew closer, details emerged that made his blood run cold. They were young women, perhaps 16 to 20 years old, dressed in traditional buckskin garments decorated with intricate beadwork. Their long black hair hung loose, moving gently in the morning breeze. Most disturbing of all was their absolute stillness. They stood as if rooted to the earth, their eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the horizon. Samuel brought Constance to a halt 30 feet from the fence. The wire stretched between them like a metallic river, its barbs catching the strengthening sunlight. The young women showed no acknowledgement of his presence, their gazes remaining fixed on whatever vision held their attention. "Morning," Samuel called out, his voice carrying easily across the distance. "You ladies need something?" Silence greeted his words. The women might have been carved from stone for all the reaction they showed. Samuel felt sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool morning air. During his years in the cavalry, he had encountered many native tribes. Some had been hostile, others peaceful, but all had been predictably human in their responses. This unnatural stillness was unlike anything in his experience. One of the women, slightly older than the others, stood at the center of the group. Her buckskin dress was more elaborately decorated, with patterns that seemed to shift and dance in the morning light. A medicine bag hung from her belt, and her hair was adorned with eagle feathers that remained motionless despite the gentle breeze. Samuel dismounted, his boots hitting the ground with a soft thud. Constance whinnied nervously, her ears flicking back and forth. The sound seemed to break some invisible spell, and the older woman's head turned slowly toward him. Her eyes, when they met his, were the deep brown of rich earth, but they held an intensity that made him take an involuntary step backward. "This land remembers," she said, her voice carrying a musical quality that seemed to resonate in the air itself. "The wire cannot change what has always been." Samuel's hand moved instinctively toward his weapon, then stopped. These were unarmed women, and despite their unsettling presence, they posed no obvious threat. His years as an officer had taught him the value of diplomacy, even in uncertain situations. "Ma'am, this is legally purchased land," he replied, keeping his voice steady. "I have the papers from the territorial government. You and your friends are welcome to water your horses at the creek, but I'd appreciate if you moved along after that." The woman's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes. Amusement? Sadness? Samuel couldn't tell. The other four women remained motionless, their attention still fixed on the distant horizon. "Papers," the woman repeated, as if the word held some bitter irony. "White man's papers for land that has known our people for 1,000 seasons." Samuel felt his patience beginning to fray. He had dealt with territorial disputes before, and they rarely ended well for anyone involved. "Look, I understand your people have history with this land, but the law is the law. I bought this property fair and square." "Fair," the woman said, and this time Samuel was certain he heard amusement in her voice. "Tell me, Blue Coat, do you know what happened to the last man who tried to cage this land?" The reference to his military service caught Samuel off guard. He had been out of uniform for 2 years, yet somehow she knew. "Thompson?" He sold the land and moved on. Nothing mysterious about it. "Thompson ran," the woman corrected. "Ran like a rabbit when the earth began to speak to him, when the ancestors showed him the price of his arrogance." Samuel's rational mind rejected such talk as superstition, but something in the woman's tone made him uneasy. Thompson had indeed left suddenly, abandoning a profitable operation without clear explanation. The man had been incoherent when questioned, babbling about voices in the night and visions that robbed him of sleep. "Ma'am, I don't know what Thompson thought he saw, but I don't believe in ghosts or spirits. This is good grazing land, nothing more. I intend to run cattle here and make an honest living." The woman nodded slowly, as if she had expected this response. "The earth does not care what you believe, Blue Coat. It knows what it knows. Your iron thorns cannot contain what has always been free." She gestured toward the barbed wire fence, and Samuel felt a chill run down his spine. The wire seemed to shimmer in the morning light, the barbs casting tiny shadows that danced and moved despite the steady sun. "What do you want?" Samuel asked, abandoning pretense. "If you have a grievance with the territorial government, take it up with them. But I won't be intimidated off my own land." "We want nothing from you," the woman replied. "We are here because the land called us. We wait because waiting is required. When the time comes, you will understand." "Understand what?" But the woman had turned her attention back to the horizon, and Samuel realized the conversation was over. The 5 women resumed their statue-like stillness, as if his presence had become irrelevant. Frustrated, and more than a little unnerved, Samuel mounted Constance and rode back toward the ranch house. The day passed in a blur of routine tasks. Samuel checked his cattle, repaired a section of roof damaged by the previous week's hailstorm, and rode the perimeter of his property. Each time he passed the northern fence line, the 5 women remained in their positions, unmoving and silent. By evening, their continued presence had become a constant weight on his thoughts. Samuel had invited his neighbor, Jake Morrison, for dinner and cards. Morrison ran a smaller spread to the east, and had become Samuel's closest friend in the territory. The two men had served in different units during the war, but shared the bond of veterans trying to build new lives in an unforgiving land. Morrison arrived at sunset, his weathered face showing the strain of another difficult day. Drought had been threatening the region for months, and every rancher was watching the skies with growing anxiety. "You look like you've seen a ghost," Morrison said as he dismounted. "Everything all right?" Samuel hesitated, then decided to share his concerns. "Had some visitors today. 5 native women standing by the north fence. Been there all day just watching." Morrison's expression grew serious. "What tribe?" "Couldn't tell. They were dressed traditional, but something was off about them. They just stood there, still as stones." "Thompson mentioned something similar before he left," Morrison said quietly. "Said there were women who appeared at dawn and disappeared at dusk. Claimed they were trying to tell him something." Samuel led Morrison inside, where a simple meal of beef stew and cornbread waited. The ranch house was spartanly furnished but comfortable, with a large stone fireplace dominating one wall and bookshelves filled with agricultural journals and military histories. Oil lamps cast a warm glow over the rough-hewn furniture Samuel had built himself. "Thompson was drinking heavily toward the end," Samuel said as they sat down to eat. "Could have been seeing things." "Maybe," Morrison agreed, but his tone suggested doubt. "But other folks have reported strange happenings around these parts. Cattle found in impossible places, tracks that appear overnight, sounds that don't match any known animal." Samuel wanted to dismiss such talk as frontier superstition, but the memory of the 5 women's unnatural stillness made him hesitate. "You think there's truth to it?" Morrison was quiet for a long moment, staring into his stew. "I think this land has seen more than its share of blood and sorrow. Sometimes I wonder if places can hold on to memories the way people do." They finished their meal in contemplative silence, then settled into their weekly poker game. The familiar ritual of cards and conversation helped ease Samuel's tension, but his mind kept drifting to the women by the fence. Were they still there? Would they remain through the night? As if reading his thoughts, Morrison glanced toward the north-facing window. "You planning to do anything about them?" "Like what?" "They're not on my property, and they haven't made any threats. Can't arrest people for standing in public land. Could ride into town, talk to the sheriff." Samuel considered this, then shook his head. "Hartwell's got enough troubles without borrowing more. Besides, what would I tell him? That 5 women are standing peacefully outside my fence?" Morrison nodded, understanding the dilemma. In a territory where real violence was commonplace, the authorities had little time for ambiguous situations. "Just be careful, Sam. This land has a way of testing a man's resolve." After Morrison left, Samuel stood on his porch, studying the northern fence line. The moon was nearly full, casting silver light across the grassland. He could make out 5 dark shapes still standing in their positions, as motionless as they had been that morning. The sight sent a chill down his spine that had nothing to do with the cool night air. Samuel's sleep was fitful, filled with strange dreams of endless grasslands and voices speaking in languages he couldn't understand. He woke several times, each time compelled to check the window facing north. The women remained at their posts, visible in the moonlight like sentinels guarding some ancient secret. Dawn brought no relief. Samuel rose to find the 5 women still standing by the fence, their positions unchanged from the previous day. He began to wonder if they had moved at all during the night, or if they possessed some inhuman ability to remain perfectly still for hours at a time. The second day followed the same pattern as the first. Samuel went about his chores with growing unease, acutely aware of the watching eyes beyond his fence. He found himself making excuses to avoid the northern section of his property, a reaction that angered him even as he couldn't seem to control it. That evening, he rode into town to purchase supplies and perhaps find answers to the questions that plagued his thoughts. The settlement of Clearwater existed primarily to serve the surrounding ranches, consisting of a general store, saloon, church, and sheriff's office, clustered around a dusty main street. The blacksmith shop and livery stable completed the essential services needed by the scattered population. Samuel found Sheriff Collins in the saloon, nursing a whiskey and looking every bit as weathered as the territory he served. Collins was a fair man, if somewhat overwhelmed by the vast area under his jurisdiction. He greeted Samuel with the weary nod of someone who had seen too much and expected to see more. "Evening, Sam." Heard you had some visitors out your way. News traveled fast in small communities, and Samuel wasn't surprised that word had spread. 5 native women. Been standing by my north fence for 2 days straight. Collins took a sip of his whiskey, considering. Any of them armed? Not that I could see. They're just standing there, watching. Watching what? That's what I'd like to know. Collins was quiet for a moment, then gestured for Samuel to join him at the bar. Buy you a drink? Samuel accepted, and the 2 men sat in companionable silence while the sheriff gathered his thoughts. The saloon was nearly empty, populated only by a few cowboys from the larger spreads, and a traveling salesman who looked distinctly uncomfortable in the rough surroundings. You know anything about the history of your land? Collins finally asked. Some. Cattle country, good water. Buffalo used to graze there. More than that, Collins said quietly. That particular piece of ground has significance to several tribes. Something about a sacred site, a place where the spirits of their ancestors gather. Samuel felt his stomach tighten. The territorial government didn't mention anything about that when they sold me the land. They wouldn't. Sacred sites don't mean much to politicians looking to raise revenue. So what am I supposed to do? I invested everything I have in that property. Collins finished his whiskey and signaled for another. Legally, you're in the clear. You bought the land fair and square, and those women have no right to interfere with your operations. But sometimes legal and practical are 2 different things. Meaning you might want to consider whether this is a fight worth having. Thompson was a stubborn man, and look how that turned out for him. Samuel left the saloon more troubled than when he had entered. The ride back to his ranch was accomplished in darkness, with only the moon and stars to guide his way. As he approached his property, he could see the 5 women still standing by the fence, their silhouettes distinct against the night sky. That night, Samuel dreamed of buffalo herds, thundering across endless grasslands, their hoofbeats drumming a rhythm that seemed to match his heartbeat. He saw native warriors on painted horses, their faces painted for war, their eyes filled with fierce determination. Most disturbing of all, he saw himself as an old man, alone and broken, wandering through empty pastures where cattle should have grazed. The 3rd day brought a change. Samuel woke to find only 4 women standing by the fence. The older woman, the one who had spoken to him, was nowhere to be seen. The remaining 4 maintained their vigil, but something in their posture suggested increased tension. Samuel's unease grew throughout the day. He found himself constantly checking the fence line, looking for signs of the missing woman. His cattle seemed restless, moving in tight groups and startling at sounds that normally wouldn't have bothered them. Even Constance appeared nervous, her ears constantly flicking and her eyes rolling at shadows. That evening, Samuel discovered where the missing woman had gone. She stood in the center of his pasture, perhaps 100 yards from the ranch house, her presence as inexplicable as it was impossible. The fence showed no signs of being cut or damaged, yet somehow she had passed through the barrier that was supposed to keep intruders out. Samuel approached her on foot, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. The woman showed no reaction to his presence. Her attention focused on something only she could see. In the fading light, her buckskin dress seemed to shimmer with an inner radiance, and the beadwork appeared to move and shift in patterns that hurt to look at directly. "How did you get in here?" Samuel demanded, his voice harsher than he intended. The woman turned to face him, and Samuel felt his breath catch. Her eyes held depths that seemed to stretch beyond the physical world, as if she were seeing through him to something far more significant than his mortal presence. "Fences cannot hold what belongs to the earth," she said simply. "Iron thorns cannot cage the wind. This is private property. You're trespassing." "Property," she repeated, and Samuel heard the same bitter amusement he had detected before. "Tell me, Bluecoat, do you own the grass your cattle eat? Do you own the water they drink? Do you own the air they breathe? I own the land they graze on. Land cannot be owned, only borrowed. Your people have forgotten this truth, but the earth remembers. The ancestors remember." Samuel's frustration boiled over. "Look, I don't know what game you're playing, but I won't be driven off my property by superstition and scare tactics. I have work to do and a living to make." The woman's expression grew sad, and for a moment she looked almost human. "You are not the first to try to cage what cannot be caged. You will not be the last. But the earth is patient, and the ancestors are eternal." She began to walk away, moving toward the fence with fluid grace. Samuel watched in amazement as she approached the barbed wire barrier, expecting her to search for a gap or damaged section. Instead, she walked directly toward the fence and seemed to pass through it without disturbing a single strand of wire. Samuel ran to the fence, examining every inch of the barrier. The wire was intact, stretched tight between the posts, just as he had installed it. There was no possible way a person could have passed through without cutting the wire or climbing over, yet he had seen her do exactly that. That night, Samuel's dreams were more vivid than ever. He saw the land as it had been centuries ago, a vast ocean of grass beneath an endless sky. Buffalo herds stretched from horizon to horizon, their numbers beyond counting. Native hunters rode among them with skill and reverence, taking only what they needed and leaving the rest to perpetuate the cycle of life. He saw the arrival of the first white settlers, their covered wagons cutting deep ruts in the pristine grassland. He watched as the buffalo disappeared, slaughtered for their hides and tongues while their meat rotted in the sun. He witnessed the native people's desperate attempts to protect their way of life, their final defeats, their forced removal to distant reservations. But most disturbing of all, he saw what the land had become, divided by fences and roads, carved up into parcels and sold to the highest bidder. The great herds replaced by domestic cattle, the hunting grounds transformed into grazing land for animals that knew nothing of the old ways. Samuel woke with tears on his cheeks, feeling as if he had witnessed the death of something sacred and irreplaceable. The emotions from his dream lingered, making him question everything he thought he knew about his relationship with the land. The fourth day brought no relief. All 5 women had returned to their positions by the fence, but their presence seemed more oppressive than before. Samuel's cattle refused to graze in the northern pasture, clustering instead in the southern sections despite the better grass near the creek. Even his dog, a loyal border collie named Rex, would not venture north of the ranch house. Samuel tried to lose himself in work, but every task seemed to bring him closer to the fence line and the watching women. He found himself studying their faces, trying to understand what they wanted from him. The older woman's eyes held a mixture of sadness and determination that made him deeply uncomfortable. As the sun reached its zenith, Samuel made a decision that surprised him. He saddled Constance and rode to the fence, stopping just short of the barbed wire barrier. The 5 women showed no reaction to his approach, but he sensed their attention focusing on him. "What do you want me to do?" he called out, his voice carrying across the distance. "I can't just abandon everything I've worked for." The older woman stepped forward, her movement graceful and deliberate. "We want nothing from you, Bluecoat. We are here because the land called us. We wait because waiting is required." "Required for what?" "For you to understand what you have done, what you continue to do." Samuel felt anger rising in his chest. "I haven't done anything wrong. I bought this land legally and I'm using it to raise cattle. That's not a crime." "No," the woman agreed. "It is not a crime by your laws. But there are older laws, deeper truths. The earth does not recognize your papers or your fences. Then what does it recognize?" The woman was quiet for a long moment, her eyes studying Samuel with an intensity that made him squirm. "Respect," she said finally. "Balance. The understanding that we are not masters of the land, but its children." Samuel wanted to argue, to point out the practical realities of ranching and business, but something in the woman's tone stopped him. He had heard similar words from his grandfather, a man who had farmed the same land for 60 years and claimed to understand its moods and needs. "I respect the land," Samuel said, though the words felt hollow even as he spoke them. "I take care of it." "Do you?" the woman asked. "Or do you take from it?" The question hit Samuel like a physical blow. He thought of his cattle, constantly grazing and trampling the grass. He thought of the water they consumed, the mineral licks he had installed, the salt blocks that would eventually leach into the soil. He thought of the barbed wire fence that prevented the natural migration of wildlife. "I'm trying to make a living," Samuel said, but his voice lacked conviction. "As did Thompson," the woman replied. "As do all your kind. But the earth grows weary of giving without receiving. The ancestors grow restless watching their sacred places violated." "What sacred places? This is just grazing land." The woman pointed toward a small rise in the northern section of Samuel's property. 300 winters ago, my people held ceremonies on that hill. They danced to honor the buffalo, to thank the earth for its abundance. The spirits of their ancestors still gather there when the moon is full. Samuel followed her gesture, studying the hill with new eyes. It was a pleasant spot, with a commanding view of the surrounding plains and a small grove of ancient cottonwoods. He had planned to build a line cabin there eventually, a shelter for cowboys working the northern pastures. "I didn't know," Samuel said quietly. "Your people rarely do," the woman replied. "You see land as something to be conquered, divided, sold. We see it as our mother, our teacher, our sacred trust." The conversation continued throughout the afternoon, with the woman patiently explaining her people's connection to the land. Samuel found himself drawn into a worldview he had never considered, one that saw the earth as a living entity, deserving of respect and reverence. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Samuel made a decision that would change everything. He dismounted from Constance and walked to the fence, studying the barrier he had worked so hard to install. "What would you have me do?" he asked. The woman's expression softened slightly. "Listen," she said. "The earth will tell you what it needs." That night, Samuel walked his property under the full moon, seeing it with new eyes. He noticed things he had missed before, the way certain areas seemed to pulse with energy, the paths worn by generations of wild animals, the places where the grass grew thicker and greener. He stood on the hill the woman had indicated, and for a moment he could almost hear the echo of ancient drums and chanting voices. Samuel's transformation was gradual but profound. Over the following weeks, he began to make changes to his ranching operation. He removed sections of fence that blocked wildlife corridors, allowing deer and elk to follow their traditional migration routes. He reduced his herd size, giving the grass time to recover between grazings. He installed solar water pumps that were gentler on the creek ecosystem. Most significantly, he declared the ceremonial hill off-limits to cattle, fencing it not to keep things out, but to preserve what was within. The 5 women watched these changes with approval, their vigil gradually becoming less oppressive and more protective. The transformation was not without cost. Samuel's profits declined as he adjusted his operation to work with the land rather than against it. Some of his neighbors criticized his methods, calling him soft and impractical. But Samuel found a peace he had never known, a sense of belonging that went beyond ownership. One morning, Samuel woke to find only 4 women by the fence. The older woman was gone, and somehow he knew she would not return. The remaining 4 maintained their watch, but their presence felt different now, less like a warning and more like a blessing. As the seasons turned, Samuel's ranch began to change in ways he had never expected. Wildlife returned in greater numbers, drawn by the restored habitat and clean water. His cattle, though fewer in number, were healthier and more content. The grass grew thicker and more resilient, able to withstand drought and harsh weather. Other ranchers began to notice the changes, and some came to ask Samuel about his methods. He found himself becoming an unexpected advocate for sustainable ranching, sharing what he had learned about working with the land rather than against it. The ceremonial hill became a place of pilgrimage for native peoples from across the region. Samuel welcomed them, understanding now that his role was not that of owner, but of guardian. The ancient ceremonies resumed, and Samuel sometimes found himself invited to observe, humbled by the connection between the people and the land. Years passed, and Samuel's ranch became a model for sustainable agriculture. His story spread throughout the territory, inspiring other ranchers to reconsider their relationship with the land. The 5 women by the fence became a local legend, their presence a reminder of older ways and deeper truths. Samuel never learned the women's names or their tribal affiliation. They simply were as eternal and mysterious as the land itself. Sometimes travelers would ask about them, but Samuel would only smile and suggest that some questions were meant to remain unanswered. On quiet evenings, Samuel would sit on his porch and watch the women by the fence, grateful for the lesson they had taught him. He had come to Montana seeking to conquer and possess, but he had learned instead to listen and respect. The land had not made him wealthy in the traditional sense, but it had given him something far more valuable, the knowledge that he was part of something larger than himself. The barbed wire fence remained, but it had become something different. No longer a barrier between civilizations, it had become a bridge, a place where two worlds could meet and find common ground. The women stood as guardians of that bridge, ensuring that the old ways would not be entirely forgotten in the rush toward progress. Samuel's legacy lived on long after his death, his ranch becoming a testament to the possibility of harmony between different ways of life. The 5 women by the fence continued their vigil, watching over the land and its people, ensuring that the sacred places would be protected for generations yet to come. The story of Samuel Hartwell and the 5 native women became legend, passed down through generations of ranchers and tribal elders alike. It served as a reminder that the earth remembers, that some boundaries cannot be crossed without consequence, and that true ownership comes not from possession, but from stewardship. In the end, the land had taught Samuel its most important lesson, that we are all temporary visitors on this earth, and our highest calling is to leave it better than we found it. The 5 women by the fence stood as eternal witnesses to that truth, their presence a bridge between the old ways and the new, ensuring that the sacred would not be lost in the pursuit of the profitable, part of the same vast and sacred landscape that encompasses all human experience.